I am live. I continue reading The Last Barrier. I'm in chapter 6. This is Reshad Feilds' journey in Turkey. This book was published 1976. It is also described as a Sufi journey. He passed away in 2016. And I have started to read chapter 6, which started with a proverb: trust in Allah, but tether your camel first, which I thought was quite good. Anyway, he is angry because he had an altercation with Hamid, his teacher. For the moment I was trapped, but as soon as possible I would get the hell out of this mess and out of this country, right back to London. The sound of an engine interrupted my silent tirade. It didn't sound like a car or a truck, but it was definitely approaching. There was no light, so I stood out in the middle of the road. Round the bend came an old tractor. I waved the driver to a halt and pointed to our car, explaining in sign language that it was broken, and could he possibly tow us to the nearest town. Looking at me very seriously, he got down off the tractor and walked slowly around the car. Hamid remained sitting up, bolt upright with his eyes closed. Hamid, I called, I have found a tractor. Could you speak with a man, please? Speak to him yourself, was the reply. Trying to make myself understood was very difficult. The tractor driver continued to circle the car, staring as though it were from another planet. He looked around in it, examined the tires and the bumpers, and lifted up the hood. Yok, he said, which meant no in Turkish. But no what? I asked. Auto yok, he said firmly. I know it's yok, I said. That's why I want you to tow us. And I made all sorts of signs at the front of the car, pretending that I had a rope over my shoulder and was pulling the car along. He did not seem to be impressed and said yok several more times. Then he came up very close to me, his breath stinking of garlic, and said fervently, Lira, chok lira. This meant that it was going to cost a lot of money, but I was not sure whether he meant that it would cost a lot of money to get the car fixed, or whether he wanted a lot to tow it. I asked him how much, and he spelled out an impossibly high figure, drawing with his fingers in the oil on the road. I turned to Hamid once more. You must pay it, he announced. There's no point in bargaining, as we are in his hands. But it's nearly all the money I have with me. You will pay it, and what is more, you will also pay for fixing the car, and it is your fault that all this has happened. Now I'm tired and hungry and extremely angry. Pay what he asks and hurry up. Some hours later the car was left outside a small workshop in the village, and we had found one cramped, dirty and airless room in the local inn. The cost of getting the car fixed was ridiculously high, and Hamid said not another word to me as we made a dreary meal of provisions from the car. There was one large double bed in the room upon which he and I lay down in our clothes. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, Hamid shook my shoulder roughly. Remember, he said, there was no rock there. If you had not shouted out in that stupid way, we've made it, we might still have proceeded smoothly. Now, before you go to sleep, pray to be forgiven for your arrogance and carelessness, otherwise our journey is at an end. With that he rolled over and was soon snoring, the whole bed shaking to the vibration. The garage man told us in the morning that it would take at least a day to fix the car, as they had to find some spare parts in another town before work could be started, and the car that would collect the parts was away at a wedding in yet another village. The wedding goers had been due back the day before, we were informed, but it must have been a very good wedding, since no one had yet returned from it. I sat and watched as Hamid addressed the crowd that had begun to gather outside the garage. I could not make out what they were discussing, but I was becoming accustomed to Hamid's ways. It didn't really matter what he said if anyone was prepared to listen with an inner ear. His voice carried deeper meanings than appeared on the surface. I would watch him talking about some sentences from the Quran or from the writings of one of the Sufi masters, and each of his listeners would get from the discussion as much as they could absorb, no more and no less. At times he would go on and on discussing one particular phrase, and then I would realize that all the energy in the conversation was being directed to one person who was listening correctly. For my part, I was still shaken by the experiences of the day before. I was bitter and angry, but I also felt that to give up at this stage was pointless and would indicate a marked lack of perseverance. Once a long time before, Hamid had told me, to be on this path you need two legs. One is the leg of your predisposition, or the possibilities latent within you, and the other is the leg of perseverance. One without the other is useless. It had become clear to me that if I were to proceed, I would have to give up all of the knowledge I thought I had acquired over the years. These 3 days had completely shattered any aspirations I'd had to be a teacher myself. I realized that I knew absolutely nothing. During one of our first meetings in London, Hamid had said to me that if we truly commit ourselves to this path, then we are given exactly what we need. Yet did I really need all that I had experienced during this short trip? Surely there must be some other way of proving my courage than that drive across the mountains. Nothing could persuade me that there had not been a rock lying in the road. I also found it disturbing that, after all this time, Hamid remained such an enigma. I really knew nothing about him at all. It was as though the situation had been taken out of my hands a long time ago, and all that had come to pass was unavoidable. I was still struggling with that idea. It was one thing to sense the inevitability of something. It was another to abandon yourself to what was going on. It is easy to know intellectually that it is necessary to go to a teacher with both hands, but actually suspending judgment is very difficult. As the morning wore on, I calmed down and determined to try to trust more. There was nothing to do. I went for a walk up in the hills behind the village. Everything was still and quiet at noontime. The call to prayer had sounded, and most of the village was deserted. Looking down, I could see the square outside the garage and the old car parked by the side of the road. The inn was round the corner of the street, behind some other buildings. Something about this perspective on the quiet, dusty town brought back a time when Hamid had talked about the idea of reversing space. He had explained to me that the average human being believes that he or she is cause to something, and therefore everything starts with the ego center, projecting itself outwards onto the screen of life. As long as we live in that space of the ego center, there can be the appearance of change, but no real change can come about. It was hard for me to see what real change could mean. He had said that it was not a matter of the expansion of consciousness, but rather of breaking through consciousness. In other words, in order to break through consciousness, you must first come upon your true identity. This means leaving behind all concepts, all ideas, all thoughts of what you might be. You must die to what you think you are and be born into what you really are. That is the true heritage of the soul. Hamid had also told me about another way of viewing life, by allowing oneself to be viewed. He described a spiral moving towards a central point. What you are, he said, is the composite manifestation of a moment of time. The spiral is continuously working its way towards the center, reforming you each moment. But because you think you are the cause of something, the movement of the spiral is blocked. God needs man, but he can only bring man to himself when man truly knows that he needs God. He then taught me an exercise for what he called reversing space, which involved sitting very still with all attention focused in the center of the chest, and slowly surrendering and realizing that instead of looking, you are being observed. Instead of hearing, you are being heard. Instead of touching, you are being touched. Instead of tasting, you are food for God, and you are being tasted. To make yourself good tasting, he said, finally allow yourself to be breathed. Abandon yourself completely in trust, and in the realization that you are powerless in the face of God, the first cause. I sat there on the hill looking back over the past few days, and I realized that I had ceased to search and had begun to listen for the answer. I suddenly understood that it was most certainly necessary to seek, to ask the question rather than pushing away the answer by chasing after it. One must ask and listen at the same time, in trust and good faith that the answer is contained in the question. At that moment I knew that I was being observed, that I was being heard, that I was dissolving and becoming food for the great transformation process that was taking place in the universe. I was no more centered in a place from which everything began with a little I, but rather the I was being formed in me. At the same time that I was dying, I was being born, and the senses that I used to hear with, to see with, to taste and touch with, were the senses of a greater being, used for a purpose that no human mind could comprehend. I was only a vehicle through which something of natural order was being born. There was no need to question or doubt, for in that moment was something that was beyond even trust. I do not remember how long I remained sitting on the hill. When at last I returned to the village, I was very quiet. Hamid obviously knew what was going on, and he did not bother me more than to say that the car would be fixed in the morning, and then we would be proceeding. His anger seems to have gone, and he was busy talking to the mechanic and his friends who had gathered around. The foreign sounds carried intensity, but no meaning, and my mind turned to the woman with the blue wool. As I pictured her waiting in her room inside, sitting beside the window, I felt that I was able to see her for the first time. I allowed her to see me, to look at me and through me, and he began slowly to understand the pain of all women of the earth, waiting to be recognized, so that they can at last be free. No more did I see her as a person wounded on the path, but as a living sacrifice to remind the world of the responsibility we have to women and to the woman within, the unrecognized and waiting to be born into freedom. She became for me during those moments a mirror in which I could see the reflection of the woman within my own being and the damage that I did her with each moment of forgetfulness. Hamid interrupted my reverie. I began to tell him my thoughts, but he took my arm. Now, you have seen a little and have been granted a taste of what it is to come. One day you will know why she carries the blue wool, and then you will see that the hottest part of the flame, the blue of the flame, is within the center of the fire. Tomorrow we will drive on. Plans have changed now, and so we will go to Ephesus to visit Mary. We can get there in a day if we start early and still have time to prepare ourselves before going up to her chapel. So I finished this here, the second reading of chapter 6, and I will continue a little bit quicker than I did last time.